Hello, this is Father Cory's Book Club, episode 2 of the book club via video. In a great fit of irony, we had some technical difficulties with the first attempt at posting this video. I began by prefacing my review by saying, keep in mind the phrase, "they can't all be winners." This was a difficult review to write, and so it ended up not being, I would say, very well written, probably not my best work. And I said at the beginning of the video, they can't all be winners. And then we posted the video and found that there was no sound because I had plugged the microphone in wrong. And so not even the video was a winner at that point. So difficult review to write, difficult video to make apparently, but here we are. So this is edition 31 of Father Cory's Book Club, reviewing The Man Who Was Thursday by G.K. Chesterton, originally published in 1908. We continue our Chestertonian Festschrift with a work that stands out among his novels for being perhaps most fairly characterized as G.K.'s entry into the genre of dystopia, those works which depict the future in far from perfect straits, contrary to a utopia. Longtime readers of the book club will remember that one of my favorite novels might be called dystopian, namely Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. Others in the genre are Orwell's 1984 and Huxley's Brave New World. For a more recent example, one might even consider something like Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card to be dystopian, or at least a sci-fi work sort of flirting with dystopia, kind of a dystopia-adjacent novel. Even more recently, there have been attempts at dystopia, like Divergent and The Hunger Games, though these rank nowhere near the caliber of the more famous examples aforementioned, with all due respect to the authors. One could hardly call it insulting to say that a single-A minor leaguer is not in the same league as a major leaguer with 3 World Series rings, unless the latter plays for the Astros, of course. And so I mean it as no insult to say that the likes of Orwell, Bradbury, and Chesterton far outclass some of the more recent attempts at doing dystopia in a general literary sense, as well as more immediately in how they engage the genre. Others are free to disagree and write their own critiques in response. My email address is on our website in the bulletin, or you can comment here below. Chesterton's entry into the genre makes for interesting reading for many reasons, not the least of which is the fact that it contributed to his voluminous and very diverse literary output with yet another type of literature. Chesterton is somewhat like that band that you've heard all their songs, but you've never really put together that they were all by the same band because they do so many things so well. Good example of this would probably be the Eagles, that you could listen to an entire Eagles album and think, wow, I've heard every one of these songs, but had no idea that one band did all of them. Chesterton wrote biography, philosophy, theology, mystery, book reviews, better than I do, political commentary, and nearly everything else you can think of that's ever been put into print. I wouldn't be a bit surprised to find that a Chestertonian cookbook had been discovered at some point, and it would likely be the pithiest and saltiest cookbook ever put together, so if you have high blood pressure, you should probably avoid that. But I digress, as I so frequently do. Chesterton wouldn't convert to Catholicism for more than a decade after the publication of The Man Who Was Thursday. He was a Protestant at this point in his life and career, and one steeped in scripture, so the book is formed as a sort of allegory on the themes of suffering brought up in the book of Job. It's a story of a poet and philosopher who is recruited by Scotland Yard to infiltrate anarchist organizations in Edwardian England. And so it might be well cast as something of a mystery novel. Chesterton was very fond of detective stories, as we'll see in the next edition of the book club. And yet the further one goes into the mystery with the main character, the more mysterious the story seems to become, revealing much about the strangeness of the world and the experience of pain and conflict. While Chesterton was not Catholic at the time he wrote this, he seemed to instinctually possess something of the fleshed-out view of redemptive suffering that is consonant with Catholicism, amidst writing what has also been labeled something of an existentialist thought experiment. This is a difficult book to review, though I assure you much less difficult to read. Contrary to what I said about Chesterton's biography, if you want to call it that, of St. Francis of Assisi, this is actually a very quick read. I found it to be incredibly gripping. I found that when I would sit down to read it, the pages just seemed to fly by. It still took me several weeks to read it, not because it was a dense read that I had to pause and sort of reflect on my life every time I read a page, but more that being on a pre-schedule, sometimes you sort of read in little short bursts here and there, and that's kind of what happened. I was actually reading it at the time I went to the Holy Land 2 years ago, and had just about finished it. I had one or two more chapters to go, and I didn't want to take a whole book with me that I was only going to read a little bit of. So I actually found that this, like a lot of Chesterton's work, is in the public domain, and I was able to quite legally download it and read the last couple of chapters on my phone on the plane to Israel that year. So that's another reason why this was a hard review to write, is the last time I read this book was about 2 years ago. So I was trying to piece it together as best I could. It's difficult to review as well because it's hard to pin down exactly what kind of book it is, and also difficult to speak of the story without giving away too much of the plot. On that first point, you've heard me variously describe this as dystopia, existentialism, allegory involving scriptures, which if it's an allegory involving Job, it's going to be a sort of moral allegory. It's political commentary. It's a little bit of everything. We could fairly describe this book according to probably a dozen different modifiers. In terms of not giving away too much of the plot, I could barely write more than 2 sentences about what goes on in this book without a spoiler alert, as we say now. So please pardon my feeble attempts at offering reasons why you should read this book, other than to say that it's challenging and mysterious. We could all do with more reading like that. This has been the second edition of Father Cory's Book Club via video. Thank you for joining me. If you have questions or comments, please leave them here below. If you have suggestions for things you maybe would like me to review in the future, I will probably consider them, but who knows? I may or may not review them, and be looking for more in our series on Chesterton and more book club content in the days and weeks to come. God bless.